Welcome to the Tyler's Place podcast, the official podcast of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, Southern Jursidiction. I am your host, Matt Bowers, 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason, and in this installment, I have my first actual sit-down interview with Michael Arce from Craftsmen Online. A while back, if you recall, we did some cross-pollination of podcasts with Michael Arce and Craftsmen Online, and if you recall, he played Jacob Marley in our Christmas Carol podcast from back in December. I will include all the information about Craftsmen Online in the notes for this podcast. So today you get to pretty much hear everything that I do podcast related for the Scottish Rite, Southern Jursidiction at the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C. You get to hear me at least once a week for the Scottish Rite Journal podcast. So let's put an end to all this intro stuff and let you listen to my conversation with Brother Michael Arce.
Welcome to the Craftsmen Online Podcast, my brother.
Thank you very much for having me on here. And believe it or not, this is my first interview of this sort.
No way.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, awesome. All right.
Absolutely. So I do appreciate you having me on for that.
Let's start first with your work on the Scottish Rite Journal podcast. You had mentioned you have one of your interests in Freemasonry is history. This seems like the perfect fit for you. Mm-hmm. How do you go about producing this? There's no doubt where you get the content from, but the tough thing is finding those stories and then narrating them and packaging them in the way that is entertaining to us, the brothers listening on the other side.
To give a little bit of background, this is the first time with doing the Scottish Rite Journal podcast that I've ever done anything in a speaking format. I've been playing drums for over 40 years. And whenever I would get hired for a gig outside of, what Maynard and I did for years together, one of the things was, do you sing, Matt? And I would always say, you hired me to play drums.
Right.
Letting them know, don't put a mic in front of my face. It's really not a good idea. When I first started working at the House of the Temple and Maynard said, you're going to be doing the Scottish Rite Journal podcast. I'm like, what on earth is that? He said, you'll read articles. I said, okay, I can read. I got that far. It was just natural. I started pouring through, I went on to the website, started pouring through different articles and started reading, and I sent it to him. I was like, how's this sound? And he goes, you've never done this before. And I'm like, is it that bad? and he said, no, you have a great voice for this. And I answered him in a fashion that I would, whether or not he was my boss or just my friend. I was like, shut up. Just knock it off. And he's like, no, you really, really do. And the more I did it, the more confidence I had with it. And even people that I knew that I was like, hey, this is what I'm doing now. They're like, that's your voice? And I'm like, yeah.
As a Freemason and a podcast listener, it is always a highlight when I go to refresh my Apple Podcast and then bloop, there's something new there from the Scottish Rite Journal podcast. I'm like, yes, because you're my companion when I'm driving to work. I'd much rather listen to you than NPR.
Right.
Yeah. My question is that, the Scottish Rite in all jurisdictions has such a deep history, as you mentioned, beyond Albert Pike. How do you select these stories? What makes a good story to you?
It's as simple as, do I like it? Do I like the way it reads? Does it read like an owner's manual to a car, or does it read like it's a story? Even if it is a lesson, does it read like someone's telling a story? Just because something's a lesson doesn't necessarily mean it has to read like an owner's manual, like it's boring. And with stuff like that, I can't overdo certain things. I'm telling the story or I'm reading the story from the actual journal. So, I've got to make it sound engaging, but I can't overdo it.
So when it comes to the stories or episodes that have happened, and again, for brothers that are new to this, we'll share the links and the notes for this episode on how you can listen to the Scottish Rite Journal podcast, subscribe to it on Apple or follow it through Spotify. What I love about your episodes is they're packaged very briefly. They're like 7 to 10 minutes, so just enough. It's not too much history. It's just the sweet spot. Was there one that you would say, hey, this is a favorite that I've done?
Yeah, I was looking through them tonight and I was trying to narrow it down. And the one that I really liked, because it made me think, how would that work in present day? It was the Albert Pike death hoax that Maynard actually wrote an article on in the Scottish Rite Journal. News traveled back then compared to now at a snail's pace. But news traveled that Pike had been killed. And then they actually had a wake for him that he spoke at. And all of his friends in D.C. spoke at his wake. to me, it was like, well, in this day and age, how fast would that information have spread to every media organization, be it digital or, old school radio, television, anything like that? That had been out in record time. Whereas people back then, did it take him 3 weeks to find out that he was dead, supposedly? And then how long after that he was actually alive did they have to take to find out he was still alive?
I like the part that it's the I'm not dead party, but that is a great question. And I think, because things travel so quickly in a bottle or in a vacuum, however you want to look at it here these days. I think even back then, we look back, I think fondly with those rose colored glasses when it comes to history. We've got the blinders on, and I think Albert Pike, even in his time, was a very well-known man and Mason, especially here in the District of Columbia.
Sure.
People, I think, would have actually probably shared the news quicker, and more surprisingly, I think neighbors knowing each other, reaching out, talk. This would have been the news of the day. And it would have been very interesting to see how quickly it was like, I just saw him earlier today. When did this supposedly happen? What are the details on this? I think that's really where the stories fall apart even now. It's just the headline, and then you go to read the story and you're like, well, where's the substance on this? The facts aren't right.
The second article favorite was one that I actually did a Tyler's Place podcast episode on as a follow-up. Brother from Arkansas, John Kyle Day, did a bunch of research at the House of the Temple about a year or so ago on the Reconstruction of Arkansas post-Civil War, and the work that Masons as well as Prince Hall Masons did in putting Arkansas back together after all that. And what really intrigued me about that was you hear so much negative stuff about the South post-Civil War, and for obvious reasons. Here was something they're trying to put the state back together politically, financially, institutionally, and everybody's working together to do it. And how often do you hear about that anywhere in terms of the history of a state? It always seems like it's the bad stuff.
We, in modern times, when Reconstruction comes around as something that we would have learned in American history or social studies or whatever they name that class, when you were going to school, they probably covered it in like maybe a week. I mean, it's sad these days when I ask my son, what did you guys learn today? And there's like, oh, we learned from here to here. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that was like 50 years. Right. Do you get like 30 seconds to just hit the highlights on some of this? But yeah, that's a great question. And then also, not just putting back together a state or a group of states that formed this alliance or, confederacy, but also the people inside of it. There were probably still loyalists then, just like there were loyalists when the Americans were revolting against the British that wanted to stay loyal to the crown. But even deeper than that would have been, how do you pull this now together with brothers in Masonic lodges that may have not seen each other? I mean, we went through that time with COVID, but that was kind of forced upon us. This was completely different. They didn't want to be in the same room together. So yeah, that would have been when you talk about, I know we didn't say it, but if I ever got a chance to hop into Doc Brown's time machine, that would have been a really interesting part of American history that we don't really even have movies or much story about to learn, to see what it was like living in that moment. Let's talk about the new endeavor. I was really excited. Just after New Year's, like I said, went to refresh my podcast feed on Apple. All of a sudden, this new podcast landed here. I'm like, what is this? The New Age magazine? I go to pop it on. I hear your voice. I get excited. I'm like, oh, cool. A new podcast from the Scottish Rite, Southern Masonic Jurisdiction. You've brought in our mutual friend, Brother Chris Ruley. And then that guy Maynard is also along for the ride. No, just kidding.
Yeah, that hack.
Brother Maynard is along for the ride. The episode that I listened to had the three of you setting up the presentation. You kind of narrated the history of the story. And then, oh my gosh, I could listen to him talk forever. Ruley, when he gets into his history, I mean, the guy is amazing. Is that the format that you're going to keep going through the rest of the year? And what topics or themes can our listeners look forward to joining in for the New Age Magazine podcast? Just
to give a little bit of background from it, it's all the articles are taken from the New Age Magazine, which was first published in, I can't remember the month off the top of my head, but in 1904 up through the 20th century. I can't remember all the dates off the top of my head, to when it changed to the Scottish Rite Journal, obviously New Age got attached to Wicca and that sort of thing. So they're like, we really need to change the name of this periodical.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Having this index of hundreds of magazines to pour through. And it's really interesting to go back to 1904, look it up online, because the New Age magazine didn't start off necessarily as a Masonic periodical. It was just a periodical. It had Masonic undertones to it, but as time went on and interest was greater in it, it became more Masonic oriented. The one thing to me, this may sound silly, but when I pick articles, there's a big in memoriam thing in the back of each one of those. If I'm looking through something, an issue from 1945, and I'm in the in memoriam and I see a brother that was born, and again, this is going to sound silly, a brother that was born in 1865 and died in 1945, there's a good possibility that brother grew up without running water.
Yeah. Yeah. Electricity. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, wow, these people got to see huge, not that we don't, they got to see real huge technological changes, in just living their life.
Well, picking up on what we were talking about, this is the generation that came around after Reconstruction. We were literally putting the country back together and yet rapidly expanding still at the same time. And it's interesting when you say the name of the magazine was New Age, because Freemasonry and still the idea of America as a country was a relatively new thought. And I can completely see how New Age, like we're living in a new age of time, not New Age as we associate it now with, crystals and
right.
Essential oils, so to speak.
And there there's actual poetry in some of those issues. And some of it is Masonic related. Some of it isn't. It's just a poem that maybe not necessarily even a brother wrote. And I'll just pour through that stuff and I'll see a poem and I'm just reading it if it, has a good cadence to it. I'm like, oh, that's pretty good. You wouldn't see that today.
It's so interesting you say that as well, because I've been wanting to do an episode on our podcast this year talking about, just being a man, a modern man, so to speak. And there's things that modern men don't do anymore. And that's one of them. We don't talk about poetry. We don't talk about how music or the arts make us feel.
It's interesting that you say that. And we go back to Albert Pike and men of his era, where it seems like nowadays men are separated from the intellectual side and the more robust, rugged side. Whereas Pike back then, he was both. He was incredibly literate, and then he went hunting buffalo, fought in wars.
Yeah.
Who do you see doing that nowadays? Not that men have to go over and fight wars and stuff like that, but they're usually segregated or separated into either one of those categories. Where here was a man that was writing pretty heady stuff, but then living off the land as well.
Like right now, if someone would say, "Oh, men are like one-track minds." Yeah, I think you've kind of pegged it. Like you're a certain type of quote unquote guy or a certain type of man,
Yeah.
And this idea of what was New Age back then, that's one thing, I don't know if you have the ability to do it, but if you were to digitize the magazines or the selections that you're reading from for each episode to share that, it would just be really interesting to get that trip back in time to be able to see how they even wrote it, and also the other things that would be included with that.
That's a good idea. That's not something that myself, Maynard, or Chris have thought about. That's something that'd be interesting to see how we can add that. New Age podcast,
New Age magazine podcast from the Scottish Rite Southern Masonic Jurisdiction. I got to hear the debut episode after New Year's. What's going to be the release schedule for that? And we can still find that on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
Yeah, our February episode. Yeah, it'll actually, Philosophy and Drama and Freemasonry will be out same time today, February 5th. That article goes into what's more important with the reunions. Is it the dramatic, thematic, the acting, the props, the stage sets, the costumes, or is it the message? The brother that wrote the article seemed to fall in line more with the message is more important, that the props and the design and this and that aren't as important. Where I'm kind of like, well, you have to reel people in somehow. And if you're just reading what the ritual is and what the lesson is, that may not resonate with as many people.
talking with Brother Matt Bowers, 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason. He's the host of the Scottish Rite Journal podcast and co-host of the New Age Masonic Magazine podcast and also the Tyler's Place podcast, all under the umbrella of the Scottish Rite Southern Masonic Jurisdiction. We joked when I started the episode saying you work in one of the most iconic Masonic buildings in the history of the world. Can you give us a little tour on what your day is like at work? How close are you to the big room that's upstairs? What do you get to pass when you're working at the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I get to D.C. when it's still quiet. I usually get into the office around 5:30 in the morning. My office of all places is in the basement. And oddly enough, learned recently, it's one of the more haunted parts of the House of the Temple.
Okay. Wasn't expecting that.
And I wasn't expecting to learn that. Actually, Maynard, for one of the Tyler's Place podcast episodes, interviewed one of the former curators, and my office, along with our building and grounds person's office, who's just on the other side of me, it was actually an apartment for someone that lived there previously and passed away. However many years ago. And the story is that the ghosts in that basement, in the basement, not that basement, but in the basement, they whisper. And when I learned this, and I said, I've been playing drums for 40 years and my ears ring from sun up to sundown. If these ghosts are whispering, I can't hear a damn thing they're saying.
Good. Okay. Because that would really, so first of all, it's not the first time I've heard, oh my gosh, a Masonic building haunted? Let me clutch my pearls on that one.
Right.
I heard that episode, and when you said that, I was like, oh my gosh, I want to have Maynard come on our podcast to do a Hauntings at the House special Halloween episode to talk about that. But do it kind of like Only Murderers in the Building style, where we can like walk around and like talk.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it's the funny thing is, I've been ever since he was doing the live stream on Halloween, I'm like, we have to lock ourselves in there one night. We have to do, yeah. And that stuff doesn't bother me. I've heard all the stories, in the executive area of the House of the Temple, where Sovereign Grand Commander Jim Cole, his office is over there. And oddly enough, my wife now works at the House of the Temple. She's, her wing, where her office is where Cal's apartment was. And whenever, she talks to her friends and says, yeah, I basically work in a museum. And I said, yeah, somebody died in your office. Don't tell them that.
Yeah, because if I remember correctly, you set up cameras, or you had security cameras in areas that nobody would have access to. The building was long closed and locked down. It was like 2 a.m. or something.
The only real building or part of the building that nobody other than the employees would have had access to was my office. The one was set up in the reading room of the library. One was set up in the executive hallway, where a couple different departments are in. One was set up facing the 2 busts of John Henry Cowles and Albert Pike, where their remains are actually, for those that don't know, where their remains are interred in the House of the Temple.
Also, that's creepy too, but I mean, in a good way creepy, but I mean, yeah, it's just another reason why when we do our Only Murderers in the House on the Hill podcast with the House of the Temple, it's going to be in the daytime, and
right.
The sound of a woman screaming will be me. That part will be played by me.
Yeah, like I said, my office is in the basement. We'll get away from the haunting stuff. But then you go up to the second level, and you're in the library. You're in the reading room, which a gazillion books in there. And then there's a set of double doors off to your right if you walk a little bit. And that's where more of the library is, the main library, the stacks as they call them, with just stuff behind glass, Washington's funeral Bible, and a ton of other stuff. And then if you walk out of the library, and as if you're going towards the atrium, if you hang a right, you'll see the 2 busts of, past Grand Commanders that are interred there. But then you can go out into the atrium. The atrium is amazing. And I would love to set up my drums in there just to, hear the sheer volume of it. Nobody's going to let me do that anytime soon, so that's not happening. You go up, you look to your right, and there's a large staircase with 2 sphinx on the side, and you walk up to where the temple room is, and that in and of itself is breathtaking. There's also the executive chamber just on the other side of where the busts are of the past Grand Commanders. But to me, the most amazing room in that building is the library. And I say that because every time I go in there, whether I'm getting on the elevator to go back down to my office, or I'm going to look out the back windows to see the progress that they're making on the apartments that they just built behind us, from land that we leased out for that, I always see a book on the shelf that I've never seen before. That to me is fun to see that sort of thing.
Yeah, that building is so special, the House of the Temple. And I know we have brothers that listen outside of the DC area. And honestly, if you do get a chance to get here, and even if you're not a Scottish Rite Mason, you owe it to yourself if you can do the tour and see everything. I've been fortunate. The Colonial Lodge 1821 meets on the first Saturday of the month. Just make sure if you're planning on coming down to check ahead, but that's normally when they meet. I've seen a degree conferred up in the House of the Temple on the top floor, as Brother Matt was describing it.
Oh, wow.
The steps to get up there, it's marble. I sit there and wonder, how much does this building physically weigh? Is it like one of the Smithsonian's where it's like sinking like, half an inch every year into the soil? Like,
that's a good question. I don't know about that one, but DC was a swamp at one time, so I would be curious to know.
This is the stuff that I think about on hot days during lodge meetings.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the different stuff in the building, and there's other museums in there, small museum exhibits that you could see in the House of the Temple. There is an Albert Pike room, which I was trying to creep my wife out with this the first time I brought her in. There's Pike's death mask in there.
What is it with death in this building?
Well, there's also There's Lincoln's life mask in there as well.
I don't know this story. Lincoln's life mask?
I'm almost positive that's what it is. There was a mask that was made of his face before he was assassinated.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. But the thing about Pike's death mask is that there's actually little bits of his beard and stuff still in that plaster.
Pike DNA is there. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Huh.
But it was Maynard and I, before the session, we were putting together some video work, and we were actually we were outside, up like in the dome area of the temple, taking pictures of DC and different. I would see something that looked cool. It's like, take a picture of that. No, take a picture of that. Can you get that angle? Can you do this? And I would love to be able to sit up there and smoke a cigar one time.
I'm just curious. So you were not a Freemason, definitely not a Scottish Rite Mason. You show up to the House of the Temple on your first day at work. What was your first impression like once you walked through those doors and saw everything? What
did I do to have this opportunity to do something that people are, they train their voice for certain things, whether it's singing, acting, you name it. I get thrown into it, and somebody, one of my best friends says, "You're really good at this." Then, top it off with, I tell people, I work in a museum. I work in a museum in DC. Probably not one that with the natural history and air and space, which are all wonderful places to go to if you're in DC. But I work in a huge part of American history in Washington, DC.
Yeah, it is a very special place. And like I've said, for any brother that's looking for a reason to come to Washington, D.C., or if you do happen to be here for a couple days, do reach out, the House of the Temple. Contact them through the website. I know that they do tours. The one date you guys are closed a few days, correct?
Typically Friday through Sunday we're closed. We're open Monday through Thursday. I believe the tours run from like 9 to 3 typically. I've seen tours as few as 2 people and as many as 25. And it's I wish I was able to do a tour for people. I would probably screw everything up because I still get lost going to certain places in that building. Hey, meet me in here. Where is that? I don't remember where that is.
It's next to the room
where
where the ghost
where
is.
Pike's death mask is.
So we started with your journey, and it literally came with knowing a Mason. A lot of people say ask one to be one. You just kind of hung out with one long enough and sold him equipment for his band to get asked to join.
Yeah.
Let's ask this next big question. I'm sure we have brothers that are listening that are like, this is a cool conversation. I'd like to be a part of this. I'm a Master Mason. haven't really thought so seriously about the Scottish Rite, but, Brother Matt had some intriguing things. How do you go about becoming a Scottish Rite Mason?
There's a couple different ways you could do it. You could just do a Google search, and maybe I take that for granted because for me to find locations, that's basically what I do. But you can come to our main website, the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction's website, and we have a generic petition on there that you can fill out, and that actually comes to me, and I from there direct them to a valley. Sometimes it's as simple as sending them, an online petition to fill out. Sometimes I have to direct them to the secretary of a valley. But that's probably the simplest thing to do. Just come to the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction website, fill out the generic petition. There's no shortage of Scottish Rite Masons in your Blue Lodge as well. So ask them.
Is there a comment section and there should be on the Scottish Rite petition online, so you can say, "Hi, Brother Matt, I heard you on the podcast. Love the dulcet tones."
Actually, yeah. Oh, yeah. I never thought that those words would be used to describe me. Irreverent, obnoxious, loud when he plays.
Once again, big thanks to Brother Michael Arce for taking time out of his day to share with you all that I do for the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction. And I hope you enjoyed our chat. The Tyler's Place podcast is the official podcast of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry Southern Jurisdiction. You can also find us on our Scottish Rite homepage at scottishrite.org, our official Facebook page, facebook.com/Scottish Rite Freemasonry, as well as our YouTube page, youtube.com/Scottish Rite Masons. I am Matt Bowers, 32nd Degree, and until next time, thanks for listening here at the Tyler's Place.